citizenship and responsibility.
Europa debattiert.
Euradionante al Parlamento Europeo.
Responsible citizens. Europe, the debate.
Citoyen et responsable.
Face à la rédaction.
Di fronte alla redazione.
Srečtu redakcijata.
Welcome in our March edition of our broadcast Citoyen et responsable, or in English, responsible citizens. If I say the oldest job in all times, you maybe think of prostitution, but times, customs and behaviors change, and above all, cultures change. France wants to supervise prostitution by punishing the client. Netherlands legalized the activity. Belgium authorizes windows and warehouses. And in the European Union, we have almost as many different legislation as we have countries. The European Parliament proposed in February to legislate and to regulate the system at the community level. Our guest today is Mary Honeyball. Hello.
Hello.
You're MEP member of the group of Socialists and Democrats. You're from the United Kingdom. You're member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. And in February, as I said, you presented a report on sexual exploitation and prostitution and its impacts on gender equality. Actually, there are already many texts that disapprove or blame prostitution as a sexual exploitation. We have convention from the Council of Europe, United Nations Convention, a text putting in place the EU strategy towards the eradication of trafficking in human beings, and many others. Why isn't it enough? Is it because they are not really respected or implemented?
Well, I think the more we have, really, the better, because prostitution is an important issue, and it is something I believe that we need to look at, and we can always improve the way we do things. So I don't think there's too much. And my report, which is not legislative, it's an own initiative report, and it's now become a resolution of the Parliament, looked at prostitution and gender equality, as you said, which we've never done before. We've seen prostitution from various aspects and how we regulate it in member states, but we've never really done it before in the context of gender equality. And it's becoming more important that we do deal with prostitution because of human trafficking. A lot of the women and girls, and some of them are really quite young girls, who work in prostitution have been trafficked. And one of the reasons that I got interested in this in the first place and felt we needed to do something was because I represent London. And London is a destination for human trafficking. I mean, inevitably, big cities always are. So I felt I had a real constituency interest, as well as wanting to do something as a member of the Women's Rights Committee.
But if I said so, it's because there is already a EU directive against trafficking in human beings. The deadline for implementation expired last year in April. But however, only 6 member states have really implemented this directive. So isn't it like a new text, like with really good maybe intentions? But however, if the member states do not do their work, can it work?
You're right, and it's very unfortunate and really not acceptable that so many countries in the EU have not actually transposed the legislation. I mean, that is terrible, and something needs to be done about that. But my report specifically looked at prostitution, which is an aspect of it. And what my report, which is now accepted by the Parliament, actually says is that we want to not introduce, but it favours the Nordic model or the Swedish model, whereby it's the buyer of sexual services who is criminalised. They're the ones who commit the criminal offence. And it's been shown in Sweden, where their law has been in existence since 1999, that it has significantly reduced the demand for prostitution. And when that demand goes down, their trafficking goes down as well, because they are linked. And if you have less demand, you therefore have less women and girls trafficked for sexual exploitation. So it seemed to me like that's the way that I would certainly, now the Parliament, would like the EU to go in this very important matter.
As you said, you back the Swedish model, the Nordic model. French government is thinking about this possibility to supervise prostitution, as you said, is to punish the client. If you take this Nordic model, even if you think it's good, would you change some details of this package of measures that are put in place in Sweden?
It seems to be working well in Sweden, as far as we know. According to the Swedish police, as I said, rates of prostitution have halved. There also has been, interestingly, a change in social attitudes. Before the legislation, over half of men, about 60% men questioned in a proper survey, thought that it was all right to go to prostitutes, that the whole thing was fine. Recently, another survey was done, and that figure of half had halved again. It's now about 25%. So there's been a big shift in social attitudes since 1999 in Sweden, and I think that's indicative of what would happen if we had the same system throughout Europe. It's not only about reducing demand, it's actually also about moving people's attitudes on so that prostitution ceases to be acceptable. I mean, you did refer at the beginning that it's seen as the oldest profession, but that's no reason why it should continue forever. So I would like to see us working towards reducing demand and actually tackling the whole issue, really.
But you don't believe that the principal person to punish is maybe the procurer?
Well, that's illegal in most countries anyway, certainly in the UK, which is obviously the country I know best. Prostitution itself is not illegal, but everything to do with it is. So procuring is, actually standing on a street, and what we call soliciting is, running a brothel is. And there's similar legislation in quite a lot of other member states. So yes, we should punish procurers, absolutely. And introducing the Swedish model wouldn't stop that. What the Swedish model does is actually just shift the burden from the women to the men, and buyers of sexual services are overwhelmingly male. So it's actually shifting the burden onto the person who I think should be responsible and should actually be the one who is committing the offence.
You had the opportunity to meet some prostitutes during the writing of this report?
I did. I've met a lot. I've met quite a few survivors, and one of the most articulate was Rachel Moran, who's Irish, who has written a book called My Journey Through Prostitution, who I would actually recommend your listeners, if they want to know more about that, to read Rachel's book. And I had quite a lot to do with her network and the survivors and various survivors' organisations. I also met quite a lot, particularly in the UK, from what they call themselves the English Collective of Prostitutes. And when we held a round table in the European Parliament, which we did, I mean, we did all we had a round table and we had a hearing. When we had the round table, there was actually a woman there who did work in prostitution. So I feel I did get a cross-section of opinion.
We spoke about the Nordic model. However, some countries, as Germany or Netherlands, also supervise prostitution on their territory. For example, in Germany since 2002, warehouses are totally legal and prostitutes are considered as normal workers. They have like social security, they pay taxes. But why, according to you, it cannot work like this?
That's true in Germany. It is considered much more as a job, and women working in prostitution are entitled to benefits. That itself is an interesting one, because according to the statistics I've seen, there's about 400,000 women who work in prostitution in Germany. Very, very few, about 44 of them at the last count, actually claim those benefits. And the other issue is, which is maybe more important in a way, is that when prostitution is legalised, there is more of it. And as a result of that, there's more of the criminal activity. So there is more trafficking proportionally in Germany than there are in countries where prostitution is not legal. And there's more pimping, and there's more of the things that we don't want at all, because there's more prostitution. So legalising it doesn't really solve any of that. Whereas I think the only way of dealing with that is to reduce the demand, so you don't have the demand for that criminal activity.
But do you think it's because the member states just like close the eyes, or is it a question of mentality? Because we have 28 member states, so maybe 28 cultures as well, or traditions.
Yes, I agree with that, obviously. And legislating for prostitution, regulating prostitution itself is a matter for member states. And I wouldn't wish to do anything to change that. But what I'm hoping is that my report will actually move the debate on and change attitudes and actually make member states think about the European legislation around this, which does exist. As you mentioned, we've already talked about the Trafficking Directive. We've just had a legislative resolution on violence against women, and an awful lot of women working in prostitution do face violence. I mean, that seems to be very much what goes on, and I've done quite a bit of research in this, and a lot of women who work in prostitution say that it is very violent, that they face this all the time. And we now have a legislative resolution about violence against women. So I think there's a lot of those sorts of issues which, while they're not actually legislating on prostitution itself, actually we can do at European level, and they all have an impact on prostitution and on women in general.
But do you think that prostitution can be a choice also?
I get asked this a lot, and what I would say is, out of all the people I've met and all the women I've read about, very, very few seem to choose this as a lifestyle choice. I mean, it's absolutely minuscule. Most women seem to go into prostitution because they have to. There are a number who go into prostitution because it's the only way that they can earn money to exist. Well, I don't think that's a free choice. I mean, if
Somebody can be the same situation for different jobs.
It can be the same for different jobs, but I don't think basically that prostitution is the same as any other job. Yes, there are lots of low-paid jobs you wouldn't choose to do, but that they don't involve selling yourself, selling your body, and being involved in that, and that's why it isn't like any other job. Awful lot of women, as we talked about before, are trafficked into prostitution. Absolutely no choice there whatsoever, and quite a few. And I've been surprised actually at the number I've met who actually have faced abuse, sexual abuse, and various forms of abuse when they're young and when they're growing up, and that therefore leads them into prostitution. And I don't think that's a choice either. So, I mean, I would contend that none of these are choices, and those seem to be the three main routes that take women into prostitution. None of them are choices.
And for you, selling selling your body, is not. It's only a market value. Cannot be like a service.
I don't think it's a service, and I don't actually see why we should be providing it for men. I mean, you know what? I actually think that sex between men and women and relationships are actually good and joyful and should be seen in that way, and not a financial transaction. And I think, you know, the vast majority of people would agree with me about that.
Yeah, but some people say one of the criticals also that each woman can decide what she wants to do with her body, actually. A woman or a man, actually.
Well, they can, but obviously they can. But my contention, as I said earlier, is that in most instances, in the overwhelming majority of instances, it is not a free choice. Women go into prostitution because they don't have a choice. Either they've been forced into it, or their financial situation is so bad that they feel that they have to do it to keep themselves and their families going. None of those are free choices.
You underlined a bit the problematic of the gender inequality. As you and the Committee of Development proposed, do we have to work first on most vulnerable groups and maybe on poverty? Isn't it the first step before supervising prostitution?
It all goes,
because it's linked.
It is linked, and it all goes together. I would agree with that, but you can't really just split these things off and say we're going to do poverty before we do anything else. That way you'd never get anything done. So I think it's right that we look at prostitution as part of a program as gender equality. And I don't believe that we will ever have a society where men and women are equal when it is accepted that women can actually sell themselves to men. I mean, that is just not equal, and until we change that attitude, I don't think we will have proper gender equality.
But does it mean that we have to work maybe on some parts of the European Union? before, like putting like a legislation? As we said, we can do both at the same times, but the most vulnerable groups, we also know that they are more maybe in the eastern part also of the European Union.
They are, and there's a very worrying trend of increase in human trafficking from Romania and Bulgaria particularly to Western countries. I mean, I know they do come to London, I do know that, and they come to other parts of Western Europe as well. So there's a real question here, you are right, within the EU itself of trafficking of people across EU borders, which we do need, I think, to put more resources into sorting out. And of course, it's a lot easier in some ways now because of Schengen, because we don't have passports or border controls, which is good. And I say this from a country that isn't in Schengen.
You don't want to put borders again?
No, I don't. But I do think in terms of trafficking, we need to look at ways of I mean, you don't necessarily need to patrol borders to stop human trafficking, but I think we do need to be more aware that it goes on and take measures within the EU to sort ourselves out.
As you said, your report was a report of initiative. It became a resolution. If you had to explain it to our listeners, what does it mean exactly?
It means that this is now the policy of the European Parliament, that we now have said that we like the Nordic model of dealing with prostitution, whereby the buyer of sexual services, who is invariably a man, is the criminal. That's one of the ways that we think we want to look at prostitution in the future, and that we also accepted that we want to find ways of reducing demand, and that demand reduction should be part of an integrated strategy.
And what is the next step for your report? Because it was adopted at the end of February by 343 MEPs. Most of them were coming from the Greens and the Liberals, I think so. What is the next step? Because we have election at the end of May. What does it mean?
Well, we do have elections, and obviously it will be the new mandate. I'm hoping that this will be taken up. I don't want it to just get lost, and I think there will be enough of us, particularly on the Women's Rights Committee, who will keep up the pressure, keep talking about this issue, and hopefully we can get something more done in the next mandate.
Do you think this is the kind of topic which will be complicated for the next mandate? Because we had a lot of resolution or reports from the European Parliament like yours or the one of Lunacek, of Edith Estrella, and it seems complicated to change mentalities also at the European Parliament, in the European Union in general. Do you think this is the kind of report that can be dropped by the next mandate?
Well, it could be. It depends really, I think, what MEPs decide to do with it. Anything can be dropped to the next mandate, and I think it's down to us to keep the debate going.
What is the trend in the United Kingdom about the next elections for the results? Or do you have already like some polls? Or
the European elections will be interesting. As you said at the beginning, I'm a member of the Socialist Democrat group here, so I'm in the British Labour Party. We do expect to do well, so watch this space, really.
Thank you very much, Mary Honeyball. I just remind our listeners that, as you said, you're a member of the group of Socialists and Democrats. You presented the report on prostitution, which was adopted at the end of February, and you're also a member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Thank you for being on EU Radio Nantes.
Citoyen et responsable. Radio Nantes vous a présenté Citoyen et responsable, l'émission débat depuis le Parlement européen. Vous pouvez la réécouter sur euradionantes.eu.